grace that it is that we even have breath in our lungs, God, that common grace gift that you give to all people, that we have life. And so, God, this morning, we give that back to you. God, we give that back to you through our words, but God, will we also be a people who give that back to you through lives lived in obedience to you? God, would you stir us as men and as women to be people who are pursuing you, who are bringing you honor, who are bringing you glory in all things. Jesus, as we spend a few moments this morning digging into your word, would you open our hearts and would you open our minds to see more clearly who it is that you are? We ask this in your precious and holy name. Amen. Amen. Friends, you can grab a seat. Kids, you guys are dismissed. Just so you know, you are all going to the same class this morning, so make sure that you are taking good care of your teachers, and we will see you guys in a bit. A couple of announcements this morning, things we just want to make sure that you are aware of. The first is, if you haven't seen, we have kind of undertaken a community engagement project. And so there is a local elementary school right in our neck of the woods, Canalta Elementary School, and they are putting on a lunch program for students who may not otherwise get a good lunch. And so we have gone and said, hey, we just want to bless you guys. And so we're going to actually be investing as a church in that program. And so if you'd like to partner with us as the church investing in that, you can give, and it's community engagement. My hope is that we take at least $500 in there and say, hey, we just love you guys. Here's a check, and be blessed. Right? I think that's part of taking the gospel into the community and seeing doors opened, is that we are actually engaging our community and having good relationships. Along with that, next week is our AGM, our annual general meeting. It's going to be at 1 o'clock, so we want you to be here. If you are a member, you have a responsibility to be here. If you're someone who is not a member but calls Bethel Church home, you are welcome to come. You can't vote, but it is good to know what's going on with the church. And along with that, we actually want to encourage those of you who call Bethel Church home but aren't members yet to become members. And so tomorrow night at 6:30, we've got a membership class. And if you're going, okay, well, what is church membership about? Really, for me, what I would say to you is church membership is, and what we're looking for is people who joyfully profess Jesus is Lord, all right? Are willing to be on board with Bethel Church's mission and vision, which is we exist to glorify God through discipleship, fellowship, and taking the gospel into the world. And then also understand the sandbox we play in is the broader Pentecostal family in Canada. And so that's kind of what we are looking towards. And we say, yes, you should, if you are part of Bethel Church, actually be a member of Bethel Church. So that's tomorrow at 6:30. And if you're not a member yet, good time to make your way out. All right. We are continuing our series on the book of 1 Samuel. This morning we are going to pick up in chapter 2, and we are going to read, make sure I've got my text right here. Verse is 22 to the end of chapter 3. 27 to the end of chapter 3. There came a man of God to Eli, and he said to him, "Thus says the Lord, did I indeed reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt, subject to the house of Pharaoh? Did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod before me? I gave to the house of your father all my offerings by fire from the people of Israel. Why then do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings that I command for my dwelling, and honor your sons above me by fattening yourselves on the choicest parts of every offering of my people Israel? Therefore, the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that your house and the house of your father should go in and out before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me. For those who honor me I will honor. Those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed. Behold, the days are coming when I will cut off your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house. Then in distress you will look with envious eye on all the prosperity that shall be bestowed on Israel. There shall not be an old man in your house forever. The only one of you whom I shall not cut off from my altar shall be spared to weep his eyes out, to grieve his heart, and all the descendants of your house shall die by the sword of men. This that shall come upon your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, shall be the sign to you. Both of them shall die on the same day. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest, who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed forever. And everyone who is left in your house shall come to implore him for a piece of silver or for a loaf of bread, and shall say, Please put me in one of the priest's places, that I may eat a morsel of bread. So here's where we start this morning. The priest that God desires hears his voice and speaks his truth. We see what's happening in this period in Israel's history is the sons of Eli, the priests of Israel, really had rejected what God desired his priests to be. They were supposed to be people who mediated for the people of God. So they would go between God and man. And what we end up seeing is that the priest was actually a way of foreshadowing the ministry of Jesus. That Jesus would go between God and man, and he would be the perfect high priest. Right? And so what we end up seeing is that as Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, began to reject the Lord, and not just kind of like half-heartedly, but full-heartedly, they were rejecting what God had expected of his priests and what he had explained to them he desired. God says, okay, enough is enough. You're going to be removed from the priesthood. The way that you're going to know that this is going to happen is you're going to die, right? And so that's a pretty strong message that God gives to these guys. But what happens is, as we see, is that God is serious about making sure that the priests are pointing towards his future redemption through Jesus. This is one of the things that we talk about really over and over and over and over again, is that the scriptures are looking to Jesus, right? And so when these priests are acting in a way that isn't godly, that isn't lining up with what God had desired of them, really what they're doing is they're casting a stain on the image of Christ that is to come. And so the people of God aren't going to see Jesus clearly. The idea is that God desires these priests to represent to the people the hope that he has given and the fulfillment of the promise that he is bringing, that there will one day be a perfect high priest who will offer a sacrifice, not of sheep and goats, but he'll offer his own life. He'll lay it down on the cross in our place, the perfect sacrifice. Right? And so what you see is all of this is beginning to look towards Jesus, and these priests, even before Jesus showed up, should have been imitating what Christ would be. Then what we see as we track along and we get to the New Testament is that the authors of the New Testament establish that Jesus is our high priest. Right? It's one of the roles that he performs on our behalf. And then what we see as we keep plugging along with that is that we are actually supposed to imitate him. Right? There's this great text in the scripture where we find out that the Christians, the people who followed Jesus, were first followed Christians in Antioch, and they were called little Christs. Right? The idea was that this was making fun of people who followed Jesus. They're going, oh, look at all you little Christs walking around. But the idea was, and the Christians embraced that wholeheartedly, like, yeah, that's what we want to be, as people who imitate Jesus. So track with me here for a moment. If we are people who imitate Jesus, and Jesus is the perfect high priest, then are we not also supposed to imitate him in his priestly work? We imitate everything he does, right? You could see pictures of this if you maybe have been around little kids. Oftentimes they will imitate those who are older than them and are important in their lives. My own household, we see this every now and again. My girls really like to be like their mom. And in most ways, this is really great. In some ways, this kind of comes back to bite me at times, right? Because I'm a bit of a fidgety person. And so I like to, or I shouldn't say like, I have habits of a fidgety person, right? Like I bite my nails, I crack my knuckles, and that doesn't always go over well with my significant other. Right? And so one of the things that I noticed recently was that we had dropped Caitlin off at the airport, and she had flown out. She was going to visit her family on the island. I'm like, man, I have a week where popping my knuckles and biting my fingernails is not going to be an issue. And as we're driving back from the airport in her vehicle, I'm like, just going to town, biting my nails, right? Because I'm a fidgety person, and I just hear from the back seat, "Daddy, why are you chewing your nails in Mommy's car?" I'm like, no, right? And there's this moment of imitation that happens where my girls begin to embrace being like their mother, which is usually really great, except for in that particular instance. But that's what we ought to be like with Christ. As we watch what he does, we imitate his ministry. Right? And so as Jesus has a priestly ministry where he goes between us and God, we imitate that on a certain level. Right? So we minister the presence of God to each other. We minister the presence of God into the world. Are we perfect in doing it? No, but we do it under the supervision, the leadership of Jesus' high priesthood. Right? So as he is the high priest, we are essentially little priests in the world, making God known to each other and to the world. So let me ask you something this morning. If the people around you were asked if you are someone who represents the presence of God in the world and the ministry of Jesus in the world, what would they say about that? Would they be like, yeah, that makes sense. That person lives their life that way. Or they'd be like, man, I had no idea, right? We are and we ought to be people who are ministering the gospel as little priests, little imitators of Christ in the world, to each other and to the world. Next thing we see in this text is that God's people hear the voice of the Lord. Right, so we're looking for a priest. We see that in the text, but we also see that God is constantly speaking to his people. One of the things that happens is that, and we're going to get into this more next week, is that Samuel is somebody who hears the voice of the Lord. We see that God begins to speak to Eli and to his sons and say, hey, some things are going to change here. And we begin to ask, okay, well, if God speaks, if God makes himself known, then how is it that he actually goes ahead and does that? Well, in the scriptures, one of the ways we see that God speaks is, and the most primary way that he was speaking was through the law. Right? You look, and God's people were constantly focusing on or being called back to how he had revealed himself through what we call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the scriptures. Right? They would memorize chunks of the law. They would read the law. They understood that God spoke in that manner. Then we also see that God would speak directly to individuals. Right? You read through the scriptures, you see that God spoke to Adam and Eve. You see that God spoke to Abraham. You see that God spoke to Jacob. You see that God spoke to Moses. Now you see that God is going to speak to Eli and his sons. You see that God is consistently speaking to his people through prophets. We saw that in the text this morning. This guy comes, he says, hey, listen, because you have chosen to dishonor God, you are now going to be removed from this office of priesthood. And the question then becomes, okay, well then how does God speak now? How do we hear him now? Do we hear him the same way? Do we hear him differently? Like, how does God speak? I want you to do me a favor and turn over to the book of Hebrews, chapter 1. Get there eventually. Pastor doesn't even know where Hebrews is. I do. Shouldn't have put markers in my... Long ago, At many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things. How does God speak to us? Through his Son. So track with me. God speaks to us through Jesus. And we hear as we listen to the testimony of those Jesus commissioned to share what his life, his death, and his resurrection means. What does that all kind of pack down to? It means that we hear God speak through the scriptures. Right? That Jesus came, Jesus lived, Jesus died, Jesus commissioned the apostles to share what that means to the world. We hear God speak to us through the scriptures. And that's actually the first of our guiding principles in our mission and vision statement. That we will be grounded in and tied to the scriptures as a church. Then we also believe that God will, at times, speak and give guidance to individuals within that. Right? So the primary way that God speaks is through the scriptures. I love what the Apostle John instructs us in the book of 1 John. He says, test the spirits, cling to what is good, and reject what is evil. Essentially what he's saying is you have a firm testimony over here, which is the scriptures. Now, God is going to also speak in other ways, but you are to test that. How? By the testimony of the apostles. Right? And then the question becomes, okay, what does it look like for God to speak to us in that manner today where he gives us guidance? Let me give you a couple of examples. One I've shared before, but my grandfather had this incredible story where he was going through a really difficult time in his life, and he was really questioning the love of God. And he was spending time at an altar at a church service, and he was praying. He was going, God, do you even love me? And out of nowhere, somebody put their hand on his back and said, I love you, 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 I love you. There, is that good enough for you? And as my grandfather turned around to see who it was a guy from the church who was severely mentally handicapped and couldn't speak. And you kind of sit back and go, okay, maybe God's using something to get some attention there, right? And sometimes God will step in and give these really just very miraculous ways of speaking to people where you go, okay, I'm getting it. At other times, it's just what Christians often refer to as the still small voice of God, where inside of you, inside of your soul, you just know that he is giving you direction. Right? So one of the things or ways that this has happened in my own life is as Caitlin and I and our family were finishing up our ministry in Prince George, we knew that kind of we were probably going to step into another ministry position, but we didn't know where. And one of the things that happened is we interviewed with a few churches, and one of the churches that we talked to, we kind of, right off the bat, and this is terrible on my end, but right off the bat is like, man, I just don't know. Like, something isn't sitting right here with me. And yet at the same time, I'm like, well, I shouldn't close the door on an opportunity, right? And so we went through the interviewing process all the way to the point where we went and actually visited this church, and I preached, and they kind of voted on us. I was like, okay, we got to take a step back here because there was something inside of my heart, inside of my soul that just knew, man, this wasn't the right fit. And if I would have listened to God off the bat and listened to that still small voice that was saying, no, this isn't the one, could have saved myself a world of pain where I had to go to these people and say, listen, I know that you've invested a ton of time in interviewing us. I know that you've invested finances in bringing us down. I know that you've invested relational capital in kind of gathering around us and talking with us and building these relationships. But God is very clearly speaking to me that this is not the place that we're supposed to go. And it was just this confidence inside of me that I knew that's what God wanted. And at the end of the day, what I could come back to is, okay, I know what biblical principles are. I know where I ought to be living according to the scriptures, but God, in this situation, I need a little bit of extra guidance. Would you speak to me? And I believe that God is faithful to do that. Last thing that we draw out of this text is that God doesn't tolerate dishonor in his house. I wrestled with how to phrase this kind of point. I was tempted to say God doesn't tolerate blasphemy in his house, because really the way that Phinehas and Hophni act is kind of what we would call blasphemous. It's essentially speaking directly or acting directly against God. I think on some level, though, we also just see that there's a level of dishonor among them. And then as you track through the scriptures, where if you are consistently setting yourself up against God, then he will set himself up against you. Right? And that's something that maybe we don't love to talk about in Western culture, where we like to talk about the love of God. Right? But at the end of the day, what we see is that yes, God is loving, yes, God is gracious, yes, God is faithful, but if we constantly, consistently are setting ourselves up against him, especially within his household, there's going to be issues. Right? You see that with Hophni and Phinehas. They're ministering in the temple, the tabernacle, the very presence or the place that God's presence dwelt within Israel. And he goes, no, that's not going to happen here. And you see this happen several times throughout Israel's history. Early on, when the tabernacle was kind of being consecrated, there were two guys named Nadab and Abihu. They were part of the priesthood, and they offered God fire that they weren't supposed to. Essentially said, we're going to sacrifice to this God the way that all the other nations sacrifice to their God. And God said, no, that's not going to happen. And he actually killed them on the spot. And there's this aspect where we see that the nature of God is also holy along with loving. And so what we see in this text is, man, if you are going to claim to be a part of the household of God and set yourself up against him, there's going to be a kind of point where that's going to come to a head. Right now, we've got to do a little bit of legwork here. Because we've got to ask ourselves, okay, what is the house of God? Right, one of the things that you've probably heard oftentimes is we refer to the church building as God's house. It drives me bonkers. It's not true, right? This building is not the house of God. Believers are the house of God. All right, so you go to Ephesians chapter 2 and you're going to get the Apostle Paul, and he says, we are being built into a house, a dwelling place for God on the foundation that is Jesus Christ and the testimony of the prophets and the apostles. He goes, here's your foundation. Essentially what we see is the scriptures. Now we're being built on top of that. We, those of us who believe, are the house of God. All right? So then what happens is as we work our way through this, is we see then that if we claim to be part of that family, if we claim to be people who believe in Jesus, we are then in the house. We are the house. And if we continually claim to be a part of that and yet set ourselves up against God, then he is going to deal with that. He won't tolerate that kind of dishonor in his house. And what would be easy for us to do, especially as we look at this and see that this is really dealing with leaders, right? We see that this is really dealing with these priests who are supposed to be over Israel and giving a good and godly example, is it's easy to say, okay, let's talk about leaders and let's look outward, right? Because there's a lot going on in the broader church that could be critiqued, where we could say, man, they need to pay attention to this text and see that God isn't going to kind of just allow things to go on forever. It'd be easy for me to sit here and say, well, look at, the be rich, that you should always be healthy, and that if you're not, then there's something wrong with your faith. It would be easy for me to look at the kind of new age mystic Christians who are practicing some sort of spirituality, calling it Christian, and yet, man, it looks an awful lot more like some form of weird spirituality than any form of biblical Christianity. Be easy to pick on other movements. Man, you look at our friends in the Southern Baptist movement right now. If any of you have been following it, there's a contingent within the Southern Baptist Church who is generally rock solid theologically, where there's a group who are trying to protect, essentially, sexual abusers, people who have mismanaged power. It'd be easy to look at any one of the number of movements where there's been financial mismanagement or where there's scandals where you look at it and go, man, this person claimed to be a Christian leader and they did what? And yet what I've found so often is that when we start to go, oh yeah, well this applies to them, and them, maybe we ought to also look at ourselves. So the question I bring to my own life is, am I a leader who is honoring God? And the question that I would push to you is whether you're someone who would consider yourself a leader or not, are you living a life that honors Him? And listen to me, we talk about grace a lot, and it's important. We talk about positional righteousness a lot, that Jesus is our righteousness. And it's super important for you to know that. But it's also important for us to take time and reflect and say, is my life lining up with what I claim to believe? And listen, this isn't about condemnation. This isn't me like, well, you blew it, see ya. This is about, what does it look like to step back into what you were claiming? What does it look like to step into a walk that follows Jesus? So this morning, what we're going to do is I want us to take some time and reflect. I want you to actually look at your life and go, God, am I honoring you? Am I bringing joy to you? Or am I just another person who talks out this side of my mouth and walks in a completely different direction? And then what I want you to do this morning as you evaluate that is to come and to grab these emblems. Because here's the great news in all of this, is that in the midst of our imperfection, Jesus is perfect. In the midst of our sin, He is sinless. And in the midst of our times where we blow it, He is gracious. If we come to Him. This is a remembrance of His death, His life, His shed blood, that He takes all that He is and gives it to you. So as the band plays, why don't you take a minute and just reflect where your life is at, and then as you do that, come and grab these emblems and we'll take them together in a few minutes.